Welcome to episode 2 of Faith and Clarity, where we try to take you beyond the headlines to a place of hope, beyond trends, ultimately to truth that we hope will enable you and encourage you to live by faith, not by fear, as we all think in biblical ways and serve the kingdom of God in a way that helps everybody to flourish. And so we're excited about today's conversation. We're going to jump right in. We are jumping into the conversation with some of our friends here at Denison Forum and Denison Ministries about how should Christians help other Christians to think about and choose school options among the school options for their kids. That's a very big issue in our culture today, and one that has taken on a level of complexity really since the season of COVID that continues to change the landscape in a big way. And we'll talk about some of those changes coming along. But my friends here at Denison Forum, Dr. Ryan Denison, who's often with us on our podcast, and our friend, Steph Thurling, who leads our ministry called Christian Parenting. They're going to be talking today with me about this conversation, and we're going to base a lot of what we talk about from a podcast series that Steph did on Christian Parenting this summer about school choices. And so it's going to be a little bit of an interview, but also a roundtable as we pick Steph's brain about what she experienced, what she learned. And as we get into this, well, let me just say good morning to both of you and say welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Yep. Looking forward to this conversation. And we're going to give you a little bit of context so you know who you're talking to and who you're talking with and what their lived experience is. So guys, I've tipped you off. I want you to tell a little bit about your story, either personally or how it's working for your kids. And if you are willing to acknowledge any bias in your perspective coming into this conversation. And so before I pick on y'all, I'll pick on myself. I really wasn't thinking about this too deeply, but my lived experience as a kid was that my parents helped start a Christian school in the town where I was raised, all the way back in the 50s and 60s. My parents literally poured themselves not only into their church, but into the school that the church was helping to build. And that school still thrives today in my hometown. But my parents put all of us, 8 of us, if you can imagine that, into this private school. But then things started to happen and they had disappointment with both the church and with the school. And so my oldest sibling, my oldest sister, is the only one who graduated from that school system. And my little sister never attended any classes at that private school. So we started in the private Christian school world. When I moved to the 3rd grade is when I moved to public school, graduated from public high school in my town, and then went to a private Christian school because I'd only been a Christian for a little more than a year when college came around. And I also felt a call to ministry. So I ended up in this very unfamiliar world of private Christian college. Later on, as I started pastoring, particularly here in the North Dallas area, early on in our church's life, we had people approach us who wanted to partner with us to start a private Christian school in our church. We had several conversations around that, ultimately decided not to do that. And then at another point in my journey, I had some pressure that I'll maybe describe later about why my kids weren't in Christian school. My 2 kids ended up going K through 12 in public school, and then they both attended public secular universities as well. If I have a bias, I think my bias is leaning pretty hard in public school direction. We have great schools where I live. They've gotten more complicated as our town has grown, but I probably lean that way fairly heavily, even though I have a great deal of respect for private schools and private Christian schools, and I attended a private university. So that's my story. So Steph, Ryan, what's your story?
Ryan, you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Sure.
Well, I grew up mostly going to public schools. Spent a year in a private school in Atlanta before we moved, and the plan at that point was for me to stay there through junior high and high school. But then God called my dad to Dallas, and so when we ended up in Dallas, went back to the public schools, and so went to a private college at Baylor for undergraduate and seminary. But for the most part, most of my education was in a public school setting. That said, it was a public school that was in a lot of ways kind of like a private school because it was kind of more of a closed community in some ways. And so I don't think it was a traditional public school experience in a lot of ways. And then for our kids started off going to a charter school, a dual language charter school here in Tyler that was half Spanish, half English, and that was a great experience for them. My daughter's going into sixth grade now, so we're going back to the public schools where we're zoned, and our son's going to go to that as well. So I'm making a switch for this school year, which makes this conversation a little more interesting. Well, not more interesting, but it makes it a little more personal for me because a lot of these are conversations we've been having and have had recently as well as all through. But I don't necessarily know that I have a bias towards public school as much as it's just what I feel like we've always been called to do. But we have we have a lot of friends and family that homeschool. Our kids did private school for daycare and pre-K and seriously considered continuing on with that before, just felt like God was calling us to a different direction. But that's kind of our experience. So, Steph?
Yeah. I grew up going to public school. So did my husband. And we just assumed our kids would go to public school as well. We met at a private Christian university. So we went public, K through 12, and then private for college. Our kids, when we got married and moved to Minnesota, we picked where we were going to live based on the school district because we wanted to be in this particular district. We sent our kids to public school. And then during COVID, the year after, like that big COVID schooling year, we pulled them to homeschool, and my husband was working from home for the first time ever. And so we just wanted more family time. So we homeschooled for that year. That was not the long-term plan. I really think homeschooling is a calling. It is not mine. But I wish that it was. I feel like that could be one of my biases. I wish that I was a homeschool mom in so many ways because I admire it. And I think there are so many benefits to it. But we sent our kids back to school, and we sent them to a small Christian private school. So that's where they are now. Our oldest is entering 8th grade. And so in the next few months, we need to decide on his high school. And we don't know what we're going to do. 6 months ago, I would have said like 90% we're going private Christian school. We're getting closer to like, it is a coin toss, like 50-50. Is he going back to public school or is he going to private school? We don't know, but we have to decide very soon.
So when you guys were young, married, and didn't have kids yet, did you ever think that you would be in this conversation with this kind of complexity about choosing schools?
Absolutely not.
Not a chance. Like we were kind of similar to Steph. We picked our home because we liked the school district, and we ended up back in it just 5 or 6 years after we had planned on it initially. But it's just, it's one of those things where it really does feel like God's plans evolved in ways that we didn't really see coming. But staying flexible with that in order to not think that's one of the things I loved about the podcast series you did, Steph, is just it kept coming up. Just because you're doing this 1 year doesn't mean that's always going to be the plan. Mm-hmm. And I know that was true for us. Like our plans have changed multiple times. Our hope and prayer is that they're changing in accordance with God's will.
Yeah, and Steph, tell me if this kind of bore out in your conversations through the podcast series at all. It just seems like the reality of COVID magnified this whole conversation in a huge way because I think maybe for the rest of our lives, those of us who are old enough to remember, we're going to measure our lives by what happened before COVID and then what happened after COVID and how many conversations and issues changed because of that. Has that been a part of y'all's experience that COVID just really opened this conversation up? Did that come through the podcast as you worked through it, Steph, in any way?
Yeah, I think that it definitely changed a lot of things. Like I know so many people who never planned to homeschool, and then they did the same thing we did where they homeschooled that 1 year because the thought was, we don't know what school's going to look like for our kids, and we don't want them in and out and all of these instead of a big unknown, we're just going to bring everyone home. It'll be for 1 year. It'll be fun. Many of my friends are still doing it because it worked for their family. And then people who just switched into a private school, I think people just all of a sudden were thinking, wait, there are other school options. Like, I don't have to just do this one thing. And I can do, people were just finally doing research on the different options in a way that they weren't before, because it meant something different. It was a little more personal, really impacted their kids, how they were going to go to school, how things were going to be set up. And so people just got more curious, I think, and that's just stuck.
Yeah, and that's one of the words I want to explore as we go through this conversation, Steph, particularly with you, is the word curiosity just kept coming up over and over as I listened to your podcast series. And frankly, as I listened to people, my grandkids are starting school next week. My granddaughter will be in kindergarten, first grade. And we just learned about her teacher last night. And but this is a big conversation, a growing conversation with my extended family, with my daughter and her family, and other conversations that I've been running into. And so it just seems to be so much on the mind of parents. And obviously it's in politics, it's in state legislatures around things like vouchers and all these kinds of issues that are swimming around. And I wanted to also kind of, before we get into the practical issues, this is one of those deals of just, hey, help me figure it out, give me an answer. And some people may listen to this podcast because that's what they want. They want us to tell them what God wants them to do by the end of this podcast. And we would wish it would be that easy for us and
Seriously.
for them. Just tell me, God, just tell me what I'm supposed to do. But what I wanted to also kind of set a tone here at the beginning around, are there some biblical truths, particular verses? Are there biblical principles that Christians should think about as they kind of step into this conversation? Because the first thing that parents want to do is keep their kids safe. The next thing they want to do is help their kids to thrive and flourish in the ways that God has gifted and called them. And we know that school is just a big part of every kid's life and every family's life. And so we want to run to that and find the practical answer. But God just chooses not to make it that simple usually. So when you guys think about getting into this conversation and even our conversation today, are there some biblical truths, principles that kind of frame this or should frame this for us?
I mean, one that jumps out to me right away is where the Bible says God does not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and self-control. I think that self-control can also be translated as sound mind. And I think that's kind of going into this conversation, not being motivated by the fear of what could go wrong, but by genuinely searching for God's will for what he wants for our kids and what he wants for us. Because school is also it's primarily your kids' community. It becomes your community as well. Oftentimes with the parents you meet and the activities you're involved in. And so really kind of trying not to let fear be the driving factor for where you choose to send your kids, I think is a really important principle to keep in mind. But beyond that, I would say a second is maybe in John 3, where John the Baptist is questioned about Jesus' growing ministry. And he says, Jesus must become greater, I must become less. And what I love about that passage is that John wasn't doing anything wrong at the time. It's just that God's plans changed. And so he was willing to change with them. And I think that's kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier with sometimes God's plans change and everything seemed good, everything seemed right, and it's just no longer his will. And I think especially when you find yourself in that situation, as it pertains to your kids especially, that's kind of when that fear can creep in. That's when a little bit of hesitation to continue trusting the Lord can creep in. And it's just so important to stay flexible and continue every year just asking God, where do you want our kids to be?
Yeah, that's good insight. I was thinking about this. Psalm 34 is a place I've been camping out this year. And I think the 5th verse says, in everything that you do, trust the Lord and he will help you. Just, Lord, I need help with this. And then that passage out of the story of Jesus as a child, where it says that he grew in wisdom and stature with God and with man. And that's what every good and godly parent would want. is that your child would be growing up in those 4 ways, in every way that God would want. Steph, what comes to mind as kind of a biblical framework for this conversation?
Yeah, well, I love what Ryan pointed out. I think fear is a huge driver for this conversation, and it's something that we have to be really mindful of as Christians. But beyond that, I would say that, and I mentioned, this will come up again for sure because I'm very passionate about this, but parents are the primary disciplers of kids. And so I think sometimes we get this idea that if we send our kids to church and then if we send them to a private Christian school, we can kind of outsource their faith a little bit, or just we have that extra boost and we can do less, or they're going to for sure become Christians because they have all this pouring into them. And all those things are super helpful. I think there's a huge benefit to being at a Christian school for that. There's obviously a huge benefit for going to church a lot, but at the end of the day, parents are the primary influence on their child's faith, and you can't outsource that. And so I think when you're choosing that, you have to remember that you don't get to be replaced. You just get to have a bonus, and that can look different for different families. When you think about community and mission, like there are some parents who feel like their kids are really called and their family's called to be a gospel presence in the public schools. And that's what they feel really strongly about. And then there are other parents who really feel strongly that they need to seek like-minded community and really keep their kids in that type of community for as long as possible. And neither of those are wrong. It's just different for each family. And just because it's right for one family doesn't mean it's wrong for the other. So I think those are important things to keep in mind, and that we have to steward our resources because God calls us to do that. And our resources are our time and our energy and our finances. And some of these schooling options cost more money than others. And so those are things to be considered of too, because God does call us to handle those things well.
Yeah, good ideas. Good thoughts. All right. Well, we're going to take a little bit of a break, and then we're going to come back and dive into some of the specific things that Steph explored and that she discovered in her podcast series, and let that be a foundation for helping us understand the options that families are facing today. So we'll be right back in just a moment. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Faith and Clarity with Dr. Mark Turman. Some believers love God with their mind, but their soul feels weary. Others connect emotionally, but struggle to obey. Love the Lord your God, a new 30-day devotional from Dr. Jim Denison and his son, Dr. Ryan Denison, invites you to love God with your whole self, heart, soul, mind, and strength. Each day includes scripture, thoughtful commentary, and a space to pray and reflect. When you give to Denison Forum today, we'll send you this resource as our way of saying thank you. Your gift will equip more believers to think biblically and respond with truth and grace. So please support Denison Forum at supportdenisonforum.org to give. Again, that's supportdenisonforum.org. All right, we're back, and we're going to continue our conversation about helping families find the right pathways for their kids' education. So, Steph, you put together a 5-part series this summer that we want to point people back to in our Christian parenting ministry. That's christianparenting.org. And the leader of that ministry is Steph Thurling. And you can check that out on all your podcast platforms. You can also go straight to the website of christianparenting.org. But you decided to step into this conversation in a 5-part series. So this is your opportunity for commercially, this is your ad spot, Steph, for pointing people to Christian parenting and to this particular series. Tell us about what you were creating, what you wanted to accomplish. What were your goals in this series, and kind of give us an overview.
Yeah, well, kind of like we touched on at the beginning of this conversation, is I never expected to think so much about school. Like I just didn't foresee this being part of my parenting. Like I just thought that was going to be easy. And I feel like everyone I talk to, it's just always a big decision. And it used to just be, where do you go to college? And now it's like preschool, kindergarten, all these decisions that parents have to make. And it's really complicated, and there are big opinions on it. And sometimes that's just from outside people. Sometimes maybe that's from parents or in-laws or family or friends. And it's just really overwhelming. And so at Christian Parenting, we just want to make things easier for parents. And so I just wanted to do a series where we just covered 4 different types of schooling options: public, private, homeschool, and online, which I feel like is a newer type of schooling option.
Mm-hmm.
And really just cover what are the pros, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the hard things, and what have some experiences been, so that people can just kind of hear the good and the bad of all different models, to know that there isn't one that's the best. It's just they're all a little bit different. So parents can just use it as a way to just discern and hear different experiences from parents and teachers and administration and all sorts of people. And then there's an episode where my husband and I share kind of our own experience and thoughts.
Yeah, I called the episode of you and Trevor talking about y'all's story. I called that the ping pong episode because it mirrored some of the other conversations I've had with other parents. Is, well, we went this way, then we went that way, then we went another way, then we went. It just kind of ping pongs around, and it can ping pong around based on an individual child. It's not always that you're making a decision for your family. You're making a decision for one of your children, or for one or several different children. And those options may not be the same. Was one of the things that came out in the series that kind of surprised me a little bit, about how tailoring school options to the particular child may be necessary at some point, which kind of brings me to the next question, Steph, which is, across all of these options, are there some consistent kind of across the board concerns that you saw that parents were dealing with, that educators were dealing with, that kind of, were similar or were not similar when you came to some of these options? What were some of those handful of concerns and problems that people were trying to solve?
Yeah, I think that in general, when people are considering their school options for their kids, they really just want to do what's best for the general well-being of their child. And that's not just academics. I think that maybe, and I don't know how much people thought about this before, but I think people are realizing that so much of their child's life is spent at school. And so they just want to find an environment that's going to foster them as an entire human and help them not just in academics, but in responsibility and potentially in their faith and in their friendships and relationships and how they interact with other people. And so I just feel like people are really looking at their whole child instead of just academics. And again, that means different things for different parents. And that's probably why more people are choosing, like, we're going to do this type of school for one kid and another type of school for another. And that is a commitment, because that is a lot of driving and a lot of coordinating and a lot of schedules. But people are really trying to figure out what serves our child best. And I think that's really cool. Just the more I talk to all these people, they're like, this is what we really think is best for our child. And they're just going to go for it.
Yeah. And yeah, it's one of those deals. You're like, I didn't know that this was part of the parenting journey.
Yeah. I think everyone's been surprised by it, for sure.
Yeah. And that's when I became a parent, I was like, for whatever reason, I was vaguely aware of private options, private school or whatever the case. Homeschooling wasn't even on my radar at that point. And I just like, well, you just go to school, and you go to the school that's, around the corner and closest to your house. So one thing I think we all three have in common is that we moved to communities, chose communities based on our perception of, well, we thought it would be a good school district. I live in a North Dallas suburb where much of the growth of our town has been attributed to the reputation of our school district. And some of that has to do with the academics of the school district. It has to do with the safety of the school district. It has to do with the sports that are offered, because I live in Texas and sports are big in Texas. They're big everywhere, but they're particularly here. But we had people, and we still have people. And I mean, I served in the Chamber of Commerce in my town for a season, and I didn't realize that business people were really, really concerned about how healthy the schools were, because that's where companies were going to choose to start or to move their companies, was based on the quality, the reputation of the schools. What do you think we were thinking when were there more specifics than I just want a good school district? Did we have some inherent criteria that was just going off in our hearts and our brains when we said, well, we want a good school district? Did we know what we meant by that?
Go ahead, Ryan.
I'll go for it, Steph. You're good.
Okay. So I'm not in Dallas. I'm in Minnesota, and we have very strong schools here. And so really when we moved here, private was not on our radar at all because there aren't very many of them. There are more and more as time goes on, but like there weren't very many when we moved because our public schools are really, really good. And so when we moved, it was what is one of the best ones. It was good academics. There were a lot of options. The high school has amazing options for kids to really explore, not just standard subjects, but like we have an aviation program where kids who want to be pilots, that we have like flight simulators in our high school. Like it is incredible. There's really cool options for people who want to go into nursing, like just amazing resources. We have a Spanish immersion and a Chinese immersion for elementary. It's just, there are so many options. And so that we thought like we can just really do whatever our kids need to do. And maybe some of our kids will go in Spanish, maybe we'll go in English, like there were a lot of options. Additionally, my sister taught in that school district. She still teaches in that school district. And we wanted our kids to have the same spring break.
All kinds of motives.
That was important to us.
Yep. Ryan?
That kind of thing. Yeah. That kind of thing is important though. I mean, you don't want to, it speaks to quality of life. And I think that was part of what we were looking at is a lot of the places that we wanted to live when we were looking between Tyler or White House school districts, which are kind of the two big ones here in this area. The scope of how far you'd have to drive for some of the Tyler schools, you're looking at 20 or 30 minutes, depending on where you live at the outskirts of that. And it was just a shorter drive a little bit. I was a little, so that was part of our thinking, but as much as anything, it was just, we looked at what got the best ratings and where we felt most comfortable with that. And we moved kind of knowing that private school was an option if we needed it to be, but hoping it wouldn't have to be in a lot of ways. And that ended up being the case. But it was interesting that for the longest time, my daughter's first all the way through fifth grade, we moved to where we are for the school district and then transferred to another one to go to that dual language school because we just felt like that's where God was pulling us. And we had family that went there her first year, and then they kind of switched up to do homeschooling after COVID. And so then, but by that point, she'd made friends, and so much of it though does go back to, I think you're kind of guessing at what you hope will be the future and making the best guess you can, which I think is why it's important to stay flexible. Because you do learn more as you go on, especially if you're new to a community. When you start, part of the other thing for us was we wanted our kids to be able to go to school and church with the same people, or at least some of the same people. Because growing up, I didn't really have that. And so it was hard to manage two completely separate friend groups for a good chunk of my life. And thankfully, that wasn't that much that case in junior high and high school, but elementary school, like I never had any of the same friends at church and school. And that was tough. So we didn't want that for our kids. And so that was another part of it, is just figuring out where God is calling us to worship and where God is calling us to put our kids in school, and looking for ways that those two things can pair off of each other.
No.
What I just thought of when you were talking was like you're just kind of guessing. Like you just are using the information that you have and making the best decision with that information. But when you think about school being our kids' jobs, like we do the same thing when we take a job. Like you just take a job, knowing what you know about the job, knowing that you probably won't, you don't do your first job for your entire life for the most part. Like you go into it knowing there's flexibility to change and shift and advance and switch, total switch. And so if you keep that in mind, that schools are our kids' jobs, it's not forever. There's the option to change.
Yeah, and that's the one of the big takeaways, I think, from this conversation and from the podcast series is that it is okay. The series kind of gives people permission to think about other options and not be intimidated by them. I mean, it's can be just generally intimidating to be a parent. Period. Right. I'm in charge of this. I'm in charge of these other human beings, and it's my job to try to get them to adulthood in a reasonably healthy fashion. And so you're looking for partners, and one of the main partners that you're looking for are good schools. So let's jump in, talk about a little bit of the pros and cons. We're not going to give away all the thunder. We don't have time to give away all the thunder of the podcast series. So we'll include that in the show notes. But let's just talk a little bit. And we're going to start with my bias. We're going to start with public school because number one is we're all paying for public schools, even if we don't use them. And so maybe that, right or wrong, is the best place to start. But I remember I read a book a couple of years ago by a guy named Rod Dreher, who basically said in his book, The Benedict Option, all Christians should get out of public schools now. And he had a very aggressive approach to that and some very strong reasons for that. Just yesterday, I don't know if y'all caught this story, but I saw a major news publication that public schools across America are facing an enrollment crisis. 2/3 of the schools across the nation have seen a significant drop in their enrollment from 2019 to 2023. A lot of that is attributed to what we've already talked about with COVID, but it's also attributed to the drop in birth rate. And I never thought I would hear this, but some public schools have actually hired marketing firms to go out and to recruit students back away from options like private schools and homeschooling to try to bring their enrollment back up, to try to get because that's the way they get funding. They get funding from their state governments based on their enrollment. And they obviously have lots of overhead in terms of buildings and land and employees. And so they're actually marketing to get kids to come back. So there's lots of conversation in our country about the problems with public school systems and their brokenness. I hope we would all agree that they're not hopeless. When I moved to the town that I live in, the person who led the committee that brought me to this town was also the president of the school board, very dedicated believer. Every school superintendent that we've had in the 30 years that I've lived here has been an active, healthy Christian involved in a local church. That's been comforting. Many of the school board members are that way. I know them personally, many of the teachers and principals. There are really great, healthy Christians in every public school that I know of. Steph, tell us some of the pros, maybe some of the weaknesses that you found in your conversation. Really did enjoy that conversation with your friend from the public school environment. Tell us what you gained out of that conversation.
Yeah. I just want to say that no, public schools are not broken and hopeless. And I have the same experience you do. Our former superintendent, he has retired. He used to sit in front of us at church every single week. My sister has taught in my public school that our kids are enrolled, or that is our district, for 15 some years. She loves Jesus and her kids know it. I mean, she doesn't preach it, but her kids know that she goes to church, and a lot of her coworkers are Christians too. Like, it's not like everyone in the public school is trying to tear your kids away from a faith. They're just not. And that is, if you listen to the public school episode, that is a lie. I talked with the public school teacher, and that is what she's saying. She's like, you will hear things on the news, but we are just trying to teach your kids how to read and how to write and how to do math. Like, we are tired. There's not a lot of time to be doing other things. So I think that sometimes our teachers get a hard time in the public schools because we hear things on the news, because our news wants us to be afraid. And I think it does a really good job at making us afraid, specifically of the public schools. But I think in general, there are amazing resources that are available at public schools that aren't necessarily available elsewhere. At least here in Minnesota, like our private school that we go to, we don't have a lot of resources for kids who need extra help at school. There are like mild learning differences that are totally fine at our school. But if you have a more extreme learning difference or other special needs, like, our school isn't the place for you, because we just don't have the funding to provide those resources. But public schools do. And that's something to consider. And that's something that families just have to acknowledge. Some families do, at least. And then additionally, at least here also, like, there aren't resources at our school for kids who really excel, like the very gifted kids. Like, there's a little bit they can do, but not a lot. But at our public schools, there's separate programs that the really extremely gifted kids can go through that put them on a different track and push them in different ways. And that's just not available in some private schools. And so when you look, if your kid has a specific need on either one of those spectrums, a public school is going to offer you those amazing resources for free. And at least in Minnesota, we get free school lunches too.
Yeah. Wow.
Which is great.
Yeah. So Ryan, if you and your family had concerns about public schools, what do you think those concerns would be?
Honestly, part of our concerns going into it, part of the concerns you get if you just base your opinion off the news, like we learned pretty quick aren't as relevant here. And the one thing I wasn't sure about, when I really appreciated from the podcast series, was in the back of my mind, I always wondered, like, is that because we live in East Texas? Like, is that why a lot of these concerns I see on the news aren't a problem here? And it was great to hear that, like, no, that's the case from most of the country. I mean, I'm sure there's pockets of the country where the concerns are different, just because every part of the country is different. But it was really encouraging to be reminded that, for the most part, teachers just are teachers because they love kids and because they want to help kids learn and grow. And that was, whether that's in a private school or a public school setting. And so a lot of our concerns kind of that we had going into it, just the more experience we have, the more people we talk to, we just kind of learned that they're not really founded in reality oftentimes, or at least not probability. Every school has stories. Every school has issues. So you're never going to find a perfect school either. But it's been really encouraging for us just to talk with families that have kids that are ahead of ours, and that's one of the reasons we switched. Was we know people that go to the school district we're going to be going to now, and they've had amazing experiences with it. They have, one of my best friends, his wife teaches in these schools, and so I feel like I can trust that I'm not being sold something. And that would be really my encouragement, whether it's especially with public schools, is if you do have concerns, talk to people who are actually in the schools rather than people who are either have chosen to get out for one reason or the other, or just what you see in the news. Just talk to the people that spend every day in them and allow their voices to carry a lot of weight.
Yeah, lots of opportunities to learn and to see good things, and we ought to be, one thing we ought to be doing as believers, we ought to be praying for all of our schools, public, private, homeschool, all of it, because it really does matter. And there are really great things. Sometimes there are really hard things happening in these places, both private and public. And let's move a little bit now to that area. We have all had some kind of a touch with private schooling, most likely private Christian schooling for all three of us, but we'll group all private schools together. A little bit of research I found that enrollment in private schools has basically held steady for more than 5 up to 10 plus years. About 10% of all kids in America are going to some kind of a private school, either religious-based or based otherwise, academics, that type of thing. Steph, tell us a little bit about the journey that you and Trevor made, and what was it that maybe helped y'all get clarity about moving from really good public schools to a private school option? Tell us some about that journey.
Yeah. We weren't really looking to move, like I said before, but then homeschooling happened. And as I was the primary homeschooler, realized I really liked the faith element of the curriculum we were using. I just really liked that for my kids. And then the more we reflected on it, the more our school in particular is huge, like 1,000 in each class. And so it just is a large environment, and felt really strongly that at least one of our kids would do better in a smaller environment. And so we wanted to try that out, which is one of the benefits of a lot of private schools is there's usually smaller class sizes. Our elementary school class sizes were getting really, really big. And we felt like one of our kids was getting, and two of them really were getting lost a little bit. And so that was the primary driver, it was size, and we liked the addition of the faith element. So that was what really made our final decision, was those two things.
Okay. Yeah, and that kind of mirrors in some ways, I think, some of the reasons that homeschool parents have listed. Homeschooling's grown, as you said, from COVID. A number of people like you were pushed into well, we have to do some kind of education for our kids. And depending on where you were in the country, your schools may or may not have opened, over a couple of months, over a longer period of time, and put families really into a crisis like we've never seen before of, well, what are we going to do with these kids? How are we going to keep our jobs? And how are we going to help them keep up with their education? I think we will be spending a lot of time over the next number of decades trying to understand how the COVID experience affected kids and affected their education as well as other aspects of their lives. Not surprising that homeschool opportunities and families choosing homeschool have more than doubled since the COVID experience in 2001. Some of the reasons that parents have chosen both private school and homeschool have to do with just concerns over the environment, the social environment of what happens in every school, the desire among families for both moral and spiritual instruction. Steph, as you were talking about, that's been a reason that is in the top 5. The opportunity of family togetherness that people learn, particularly in COVID. I had a family in my church when COVID came. They had one daughter out of college, one son in college, and another son in high school. And when they figured out how this was going to work for an indefinite period of time, they bought a motorhome and they got a really great internet connection. And they went and just explored the country and did school on the road because, well, you had to do it through the internet and the internet could work anywhere. And they created family memories over a year that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. So that kind of illustrates the family togetherness still. And then the fourth reason that families gave for homeschool, but also relates to private school, is just a dissatisfaction with the academic quality that they were finding in their particular local public schools. What do you think, Steph, you talked about how you discovered that you're probably not the person called and gifted to be a homeschooler. I just got to tell you, it's almost like my wife and I just never even considered it to be a legitimate option because we both felt so unqualified to even think about that pathway. Ryan, what level of consideration have you and your wife given to homeschooling?
Honestly, our story was very similar to Steph's, where we were fortunate in that our daughter's school went back the fall of 2020. So we were able to start back in person, but that spring of 2020, she was in kindergarten. So we're not talking terribly advanced scholastic requirements, and I still couldn't do it. And one of the things that I really remember that resonated from that is just my relationship with my daughter when I had to go from father to teacher was not something I wanted to perpetuate. And it was bad for her. It was bad for me. That's something I've had to remind my kids about because they look at friends and family that homeschool, see the schedule they get to have, and they think that sounds awesome. So it's been interesting conversations to kind of reinforce that, we can't give you, your mom and I can't give you a good homeschooled education. Their parents can. That's why they can do it. But that's not something we're called to do. That's not something that'll be good for our family. It's not something that will be good for you, no matter how much you want it. And that's a hard conversation to have at times with your kids when they see something that looks better. But for us, it's just, my wife and I both work, and it was clear that this was not our calling and not something we were gifted for.
Yeah, and that's a concern or a question, Steph. When we come back from our next break, I want to talk to you about is just how the capacities and capabilities of parents factor into this decision about where your kids are going to go to school and how they're going to be educated. So we're going to take another quick break and catch our breath, let you do the same, and we'll be right back in just a second.
Are you feeling overwhelmed by everything going on in our world today? Yeah, us too. Hi, I'm Connor Jones.
And I'm Micah Tomasella, and we're two young millennial dads and longtime friends navigating the never-ending stream of news, politics, sports, entertainment, pop culture, and technology. Each week, we dive into the stories that matter, from the latest TV shows, movies, and celebrity buzz to trending topics in politics, sports, and tech. If it's making waves, we're probably talking about it.
So join us every Thursday on Culture Brief, the newest Denison Forum podcast, where we break down the week's biggest stories from a Christian perspective. Expect laughs, insights, and a bit of everything in between. Whether we're informed or still figuring things out, we're here to bring you entertainment, encouragement, and to apply biblical discernment to the culture around us.
So tune in and catch up with us weekly. It's time to make sense of it all together. Don't forget to hit follow so you never miss a new episode.
All right, we're back, and we're going to wrap up our conversation on helping our kids find the best educational pathway for them. So, Steph, I wanted to ask, we were talking about private school, we talked about homeschool a little bit, and some of the challenges. I love the way your podcast kind of describes the experience of what is it like to homeschool, and kind of intrigued really about how much freedom all the homeschool families that I know, some of the folks that we work with at Denison Forum and Denison Ministries are homeschooling. One of the advantages, they get to travel in non-peak times. So if your goal is to get to Disney World, you can get to Disney World in a less crowded environment if you're homeschooling in many ways. But talk about some of what you experienced and what you learned about how important the capabilities of parents have to be a part of that decision. As Ryan said before the break, parents, kids might want to pursue something like homeschooling, but you have to factor in the framework of your family, the framework of your jobs. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I will just start by saying that. So when COVID hit and that end of the school year was going on, we were all online school, not homeschool, but like online school. My brother-in-law was living with us, and he actually has a picture of me like curled up in a ball on the floor because I just like could not handle doing online school anymore. So when I told him, I was like, we're going to homeschool next year, he showed me that picture and was like, are you sure? Like, are you sure? And I said, yes, I'm going to homeschool because I don't want to do that again. And we didn't know what school was going to look like. And I want the flexibility, and this is going to be great. And it truly was. Like, we went to New Orleans for a week and studied the Civil War. We went to Florida, the Space Coast, and we did a unit on space, and we did a unit on the ocean. And we were able to do all of these amazing things, which is the obvious benefit in going to Disney World, if that's your jam. But I learned that I am just not a structured and disciplined enough person in that specific capacity to provide structure for my kids in that way. And so I feel like I do not regret that year at all, but I don't feel like I set my kids up well for learning some of the like executive functioning skills, like using a planner and planning out their day and making sure they got all their assignments done, just because of who I am as a person and my specific personality type and the way my brain works. I probably could have grown into that and figured out a system. There are so many resources. And so I don't want to discourage people that if that's you, like you can't homeschool, because you can. Any homeschool parent's probably mad at me right now, but because there are a million resources you can use to take your capabilities if you feel like that's your calling. But you have to be real about who God wired you to be and say, okay, if I'm going to take this path, I have to work through these issues to set my kids up well. And I knew it was temporary, so I just probably didn't do that well. And honestly, like I am called to this job. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I can't homeschool my kids well, especially since it would have been a challenge for me, and work a 40-hour-a-week job. Some people can do that. I don't know how, but people say it's possible. Not for me. So I think that if you have to work or you feel called to work, that's okay too. I think there's kind of a feeling sometimes that may be less, or like you're sacrificing a lot by doing that. But I don't know. I feel really comfortable where I am. I feel like this is exactly where God wants me to be. And that's because of who he wired me to be. And so you have to take that into consideration. And also your kids too. If your kid is someone who really doesn't do well in a school environment, homeschooling might be really great for them because you have more flexibility. There's more hands-on learning that you get to do together. You get to wiggle a little bit more, run around more. There are also schools that provide that too. So I think just really looking at your wiring and what you need to do and can do is really important, because that was very much a reality for me.
Yeah, and we've touched on some other aspects of this, like just the distance of how far is it from your house to the school.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those practical realities really affect the way the entire family works. It's a balancing act between what does this child need, what do all my children need, what does my family need. All of those dynamics play into how this works. And Steph, while you were talking, I was also thinking about my feeling is, about the time I thought that I was getting to be a really good parent, I didn't need to parent anymore. And it seems kind of cruel that it's wired that way, right? About the time that I think maybe some of this fruit of the Holy Spirit is actually blooming, I think that may be exactly about the time that God takes me to heaven. It's like about the time that all that stuff, maybe it starts showing up, and then I don't actually need it here on earth anymore. I don't know. Wanted to take a moment. You talked about in one of your episodes online school as being different from either private school or homeschooling. Tell us what your episode is about. What do you mean by online school? And that was something kind of new. It's kind of like, we had that forced on us in COVID. Why would I ever want to go back there again? But talk about how that is becoming an option.
Yeah, well, that was a very different type of online school, because that was our current schools trying to figure out how to be online with no preparation. Right. So take that out of your mind, because it's not that. An online school there are so many options. You've probably seen commercials on TV, but there are secular and faith-based options for online school where your kids are at home, but they take their classes online, and it's very self-paced. And it's kind of like a mix of homeschooling and being in a classroom. Huge benefits of it. One of my dear friends, her son, 2 of her kids are at our Christian school. One of her sons is online, and that's who I interview in the episode. She has seen great growth and benefits in this type of schooling for her child. It's kind of a way to get a little bit of homeschooling in for your kids without, maybe if you're like me and you're not as structured and type A, then an online school is a really good way to incorporate a traditional school type of setting, because it's more like a traditional school, but online, that you do at home.
And so lots of emerging resources, really for all of these options, was one of the things I learned from just being a part of the podcast, listening to that. Wanted to ask both of you, but Steph, start with you, of just as you got into this work, as you explored and had these conversations, were there some things that you learned about the choices and that you didn't know, or something that surprised you out of doing this podcast series?
I think I really enjoyed talking with Ashley, who was the public school teacher, just to hear her heart, not just for her school, but for her community. And I think you guys kind of echoed this too, is there's a really great community that you can find in a public school that's different than you would find in a different school setting. Just because it's the people that you live right next to. And there's something very special about that I think you miss in different schools. We've noticed that a lot in our private school, is that our kids' friends are spread out all over the place. And so while we may not have to drive very far to get to school, my kids actually take a bus to get to their friends. It's a longer drive than if we had gone to a private or public school where they can just ride their bike to their friends' houses, because they all go to school together and they all go to kind of a local church. And so community is really important. And so I think taking that into consideration, is it really important to you to have a community that's close to you, where you can find the Christians and the like-minded people in a close proximity? Or is it important that you have a super solid Christian community, faith-based, like-minded community that you're going to find at school, and you might have to drive further to get to them? Either way, community is really important. And I didn't think about that when I was choosing a school. I was really thinking academics, convenience, size, and the community part was something that I totally overlooked. And I heard the community element in both interviews, private and public, and actually homeschool too, because you can have co-ops. You find your own community in the homeschool environment as well. But I think to really consider what is most important to you when you're finding your people, and that will help guide your school choice as well.
No. Yeah. So Ryan, what do you want to add to that? This is the Faith and Clarity podcast. So what's become more clear or piqued your interest as we've stepped into this conversation?
Well, like what Steph was talking about with community, just the degree to which no matter what setting you choose for school, you have to be intentional about building that community. Even like in a setting where you live around kids that you go to school with, making sure that you're actually investing in those relationships. And I think that stuck out to me partly because that's not something I've ever been terribly great at. And so it was interesting looking back on it and just thinking through all the, I don't want to say necessarily missed opportunities, but just the degree to which you have to be intentional about cultivating that community, and especially as parents of kids, that you don't just view it as important for your kids, that these are opportunities and relationships that you can invest in as adults and other adults, to grow and to know who your kids' friends are, which is important for all sorts of reasons. But especially even beyond that, to look for opportunities that God can really use you to invest in the lives of other parents. And when you have something built-in commonality, that your kids go to school together, just the degree to which that opens doors to make that process simpler which is really encouraging to hear about and be reminded of.
Yeah, it's so important. I think all of us have that sense that when we're in school, especially as we move into secondary schools, into our teenage years, we know that friends become so significant in our life. In some sense, we're all tied to the high school experience that we had, whether it's musically or socially. We're all just marked in many ways by experiences that happen at school, particularly as we get older and have a stronger sense of memory. And so that's all a part of it. It's a part of academics. I can remember when the teacher that was the most popular teacher at my middle school made a compliment about me. And I've carried that compliment because, well, it came from the most popular teacher at the school. And so teachers and administrators and coaches have enormous influence and opportunity to touch our kids' lives, as we do as parents. And we want that to be the healthiest environment and possible experience that we can create. There is a temptation in here I wanted both of you to just touch on for a moment before we finish up, which is the temptation that we have to think that our choices are the best choices for everybody, and to drift toward judging people who don't make the choices that we might make in any of these options. And then on the flip side of it, when you feel that judgment maybe coming toward you from somebody who thinks that their way for their family is the way it should be for your family, we face this kind of pressure. Sometimes we give this kind of pressure in a lot of topics, but particularly in something as emotionally charged as this. How would you guys help us to guard against judging what other people do compared to what we do? Or what do we do when we feel that pressure coming from others? Steph, what would you recommend parents do in that experience?
It's so hard. It is so hard because everybody's going to give you their opinion, because that's just what we do. And if people aren't giving it to you directly, you're going to get it on social media. I just think you just have to remember that there's no right way to do school. Like the Bible says, we're supposed to train up our child in the way they should go, and we're supposed to impress God's commandments on our children. But that's telling parents what they're supposed to do, not what their teachers are supposed to do. And so I think it's just really important to remember that this is discipling is your job at home, and you can do with that what you want for taking into consideration school, but there is no right way in Scripture. It doesn't say go to private school. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say go to public school. It doesn't say keep them home. You can, yes. That's that. That's that. I could go off for a really long time, but there is no right way to do school. And so that's every parent's discernment. And so just rely on the Holy Spirit to guide you in which way your family is supposed to go, and stay strong in that conviction. Because if you're hearing from God that you're supposed to be at a specific type of school for this time, again, not forever, just stay firm in that conviction. And it's okay if it looks different than other people's convictions, because there is no right way.
Ryan, a closing thought?
I think that's a perfect summation of it. I mean, it really is. And I think it's so often, just to speak to the other side of it too, I mean, if you feel that temptation to judge others and because you see their kids or you see kind of, I don't know, you see something in their life where you're like, I don't know if I would do it quite that way. Just because you wouldn't do it that way doesn't mean God's not calling them to do it that way. And so a little bit of humility goes a long way with this on both sides of it. To understand it's like, when you receive that criticism, maybe take a second to go, God, is that valid or not? And then if God says no, you brush it off and keep right on going. If God says maybe there's a little truth to it, then maybe that's a bit of the Holy Spirit's conviction that you should take into account. On the other side, if you are tempted to speak, start with questions and try and get to know their situation before you ever try and cast judgment on it. Because I think it's so easy to look at a small glimpse of someone's life and assume that represents the totality of what's going on, when that's just never the case. And so that would be kind of my recommendation my advice with all of that is whatever side of the judgment spectrum you're tempted to be on or you encounter, just to remember that God's truth is the only one that really matters. And God's perspective is the only one that really matters in this. And to make sure his voice is the one that you're listening to.
Yeah, such a good word. And a reminder that in all of this, as in all the parts of our lives in faith, is that we just have to pray, and keep asking for the Holy Spirit to make it clear. Because, one way to turn this around is to say, thank God we live in a place where we have really good options. We've got good options for public school, private school, online school, homeschool, charter school. Some of those things are emerging as well. And how great is it that we have those kind of options, even though the options sometimes feel like they put pressure on us. And they do. They absolutely do put pressure on us. But a couple of words that I would just say that have grown out of all of this, great work, Steph, that you did on the podcast and this conversation as well, is number one, curiosity, and then faith, not fear. Just be curious about what these options might be. You can actually learn about an option and you don't have to take it. You can learn about it enough to know that's not where God's calling me for a lot of reasons. And that if you walk with it in humble faith, you can be confident that God is leading you to the path that's right for you and your kids. And it's not going to look exactly like somebody else's family. It may be similar, but it may be very different. And that's okay. God can work in the midst of all of that. Once again, want to point people to where they can find the series. Steph, did you give it an overall name? They can find it at christianparenting.org. They can also find it on podcast platforms. Is the series called by a particular name?
There's not a particular name, but if you search Christian Parenting Podcast and school, they'll all pop up.
Okay. 5 episodes that start with Steph and Trevor's personal journey in this area as they continue down this road, and then some really great conversations that explore 4 options. And hope you'll check that out through christianparenting.org. Want to thank you for being a part of this conversation at Faith and Clarity. And if this conversation's been helpful to you to understand how to walk in this issue with faith and not with fear, we hope that you'll rate and review us and share this with others. And Steph, one last word, other resources that people might look to besides the podcast, are there print resources or other things that people can check out that can help them in this conversation?
Yeah, we actually have a free digital guide on Christian parenting called School Simplified, and it has different articles and podcasts, including that series, and some videos too, that go through all sorts of schooling issues that people are talking about, from school choices to issues that come up at school, from preparing your kids to launch, whether you're launching a kindergartner or someone to college, all sorts of school issues. And it is free download. You can just go to the Christian Parenting website, christianparenting.org, and we have a store there, and you can go download it there. And there's lots of resources.
Awesome. And we'll include that in the show notes as well here on Faith and Clarity. Remember, we are a podcast sponsored by Denison Forum, and you can find additional resources from us as well at denisonforum.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Faith and Clarity with Mark Turman. Thanks for being a part. Filtering through an endless stream of news is hard in today's truth-confused environment. That's why at Denison Forum, we produce content that equips believers by applying biblical wisdom to top headlines every day. If you enjoy the Denison Forum podcast, you won't want to miss out on our newsletter, The Daily Article. Each morning, we engage the significant stories and issues of the day with biblical truth. This 5-minute read is delivered straight to your inbox at no cost and will help you stay informed and hopeful as you start your day. And as a podcast listener, when you sign up today, we'll send you a free copy of one of our most popular ebooks, Respectfully, I Disagree. In the book, Dr. Jim Denison offers biblical insight on today's contentious culture and presents the promise of a better future, one in which we can disagree with respect and forge a culture of commonality and grace. Subscribe to the Daily Article newsletter now at dfpodcast.org to stay informed with news coverage from a Christian perspective, and we'll send you your free ebook copy of Respectfully, I Disagree. That's dfpodcast.org, or just click the link in the show notes. Struggling to make sense of the headlines? At Denison Forum, we cut through the noise with the Daily Article, a 5-minute, Christ-centered briefing that hits your inbox every morning. If you love the Faith and Clarity podcast, this is the perfect next step. And when you sign up today at dfpodcast.org, you'll get a free ebook, Respectfully, I Disagree, by Dr. Jim Denison. Stay informed, stay grounded. Subscribe now at dfpodcast.org or just click the link in the show notes.